Greetings and welcome to the Residence of Evil. Beggy Beg here. For a number of days now, I've had the chance to sink my teeth into the quintessential action horror experience of our time, carefully preserved and meticulously resurrected into a form perhaps even more justified in its claim to critical success than its original incarnation, Resident Evil 4 Remake. Considering the visual and mechanical enhancements exhibited by 2 and 3 Remake, RE4 Remake's resolve to expand upon those strengths to establish new peaks in atmospheric and technical prowess wasn't much of a surprise. The ghastly beings that saunter through this lonely region, and the robust array of combat options that one can use to neutralize them, have indeed been dialed up to 11, as insisted upon by the remake's creators. But these more obvious fortes overshadow something much less apparent, but equally crucial to the game's success: the numerous additions and changes to its lore. Virtually every unique bioweapon, side character, and villain has been granted a more distinct backstory, greatly adding cohesion to the game's narrative and world building. Piecing together the truth behind these key villain figures, especially the many converts of the Los Illuminados faith, is our goal. Let's start with one convert whose name and history were left rather ambiguous in the original game, a man named Isidro Uriarte Talavera. His first memo, or rather first chronicle, reflects his unwavering devotion to the aims of his superiors, Ramon Salazar and Sadler himself. It was written 2 years after his awakening, and awakening here is effectively equivalent to the original game's process of purification, or accepting the so-called sacred blood, the holy ceremony through which a plaga parasite would be injected into a human host and bind itself to the host's nervous system. It's fascinating that Ramon in particular entrusts Isidro with the holy duty of improving upon the flaws of the human form, considering Ramon's deeply troubled and resentful relationship with his own small stature and ailing body. We'll further explore this aspect of Ramon's backstory some other time. Back to Isidro. We learn that 2 years later, he's on the verge of successfully transfusing some mysterious black liquid into the human body, and he notes that hosts with a pure soul have a higher chance of adapting favorably, of becoming the arthropodal beings that would transcend human limitations, as Ramon intended. Yes, Isidro aimed for these chosen subjects, these select wombs filled with this black liquid, to mutate into Sadler's elite angels, his exalted league of faithful disciples, just as he refers to them during his boss encounter.
Faithful disciples, assemble!
When hatched, the larvae contained within the chosen ones would become U2s, or as Ramon would dub them, as he beamed with pride at Isidro's work, Novistadors, which roughly translates to the unseen. Fascinating. So we can now attribute the creation of the Novistadors, and as you'll soon see, all insect-based plaga bioweapons, to the efforts of one newly introduced devotee and researcher in the remake, Isidro. Moving on to his second chronicle, which was written 2 years later, he describes an experiment seeking to fuse together the bodies of human and insect, which the housekeeper allegedly volunteers herself to. This is how the first of 2 beings dubbed U3 are born, mutating the housekeeper into the human-insect hybrid BOW that most veterans know as Verdugo from the original, rather than the creature that we once battled in the rig cage. But the housekeeper's accounts reveal something deeply unnerving about her willingness to become this quote-unquote perfect life form. Her first memo indicates a lucid awareness of the wickedness around her, especially of Ramon Salazar since childhood. She confesses that she's failed her lord, who in this case is Diego Salazar, the 7th ruling castellan and Ramon's father, by letting Ramon succumb to the path of wickedness, which in this case is embodied by the sinister teachings of the Los Illuminados cult. But only in this first memo can she still recount the cult's manipulation of Ramon, and still garner the resolve to continue her duty of serving him, despite her intense disappointment with his fate. In the housekeeper's second memo, though, the style and tone of her writing malforms into the same maniacal ecstasy that we see in Isidro's chronicles. Her fanatical exclamation points, her now suddenly unfaltering allegiance to Master Ramon after unequivocally voicing her disdain for his actions in her previous memo, and her very tangible fervor at the prospect of surpassing the limitations of her mortal shell and becoming the first U3, the first Verdugo. What exactly is going on here, from her first memo to her second? Two plausible theories come to mind. It's almost unfathomable that the two memos were truly written by the same person, so my first theory is that this second memo, bearing an uncanny resemblance to the emphatic, reverent tone of Isidro's files, was actually just written by Isidro himself. I can visualize a scenario in which the housekeeper, sustaining bitter sentiments towards the Los Illuminados cult, actually refused to comply with Isidro's experiment and was coerced into cooperating anyway. Perhaps to internally justify the brutal deed of filling her body with black liquid against her will, it's conceivable that Isidro wrote this second memo for her to appease the voices of guilt buried within his psyche, deluding himself into believing that this was the housekeeper's wish all along. Given the similarity in tone between this second memo and Ramon's writing as well, and the closeness and proximity of all three files in the throne room, you could also make the case that Ramon wrote the housekeeper's second memo. After all, the file does aggrandize Ramon to an excessive, servile degree, a degree that the housekeeper never would. Save for one case, though, in which she might, and this is my second theory. The housekeeper may have experienced an awakening, meaning been implanted with a plaga parasite, in the time between writing the first and second memo, meaning all the sentiments expressed in the second memo were written under the influence of the plaga, forcibly urging her to express veneration for Ramon and Isidro's dark dealings. Whatever the truth may be, she did indeed malform into the first U3, which Isidro dubs Pesanta. This word refers to a large, grisly dog of Catalan folklore, which sits on people's chests as they sleep, causing nightmares, quite redolent of the iconic Romantic-era painting, The Nightmare by Fuseli. Considering Pesanta's role as the right hand of Ramon, her moniker reflects her duty as his hunting dog, or more informally, his lapdog. About a year later, after Pesanta's malformation, Isidro would undergo the same excruciating process of becoming U3 by transfusing this special black liquid into his bloodstream, finally adopting the title of Verdugo himself, which loosely translates to butcher or executioner. This is the multifaceted account of how both U3s, Pesanta and Verdugo, were created. Considering that Isidro refers to himself as a Verdugo and a true servant of God, while simultaneously dubbing the mutated housekeeper of Pesanta a mere hunting dog, the entitlement and pompousness are quite apparent in Isidro, emblematic of Ramon's narcissism rubbing off on him, despite his selfless attitude towards his master. An elite bioweapon from the original game with very little definition or detail has now been imbued with this immaculate backstory intertwined with the histories of Ramon and his housekeeper since childhood. This is just a morsel of Resident Evil 4 Remake's additive lore. Which of my theories of the housekeeper's memo, Pesanta's memo, if any, do you find most plausible? Would you like to see more lore explorations on Resident Evil 4 Remake? Let us know in the comments. I'll see you again soon, I'm sure. Perhaps, just as I transcend the limitations of the human form,